You know, we usually think of infrastructure as this universal language of progress, right? I mean, when a nation builds roads, bridges, and especially massive railway networks, we kind of just expect a huge boom in industrialization. We expect a thriving middle class, surging economic growth, the whole nine yards. But what happens when building one of the largest railway networks on the planet actually does the exact opposite? Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we are unpacking a really fascinating piece of historical source material to explore what we call the Indian Railway Paradox. We're going to look at exactly how a massive technological leap actually drove a thriving local economy backward. So, let's dive right in.
Here is our roadmap for the explainer today. We'll be looking at Marx's theory of industrialization, the Indian railway paradox itself, the fall of traditional handicrafts, the great wealth drain, and finally, we'll wrap up by evaluating the true colonial impact. To truly understand just how bizarre the situation in colonial India actually was, we first need to establish our baseline. So, Section 1, Marx's theory of industrialization.
Okay, so according to Karl Marx's universally recognized formula, if a country has abundant coal, rich iron ore, and then introduces mechanized transport, like railways, it basically triggers this unstoppable chain reaction. It's like a giant puzzle where all the pieces just fall into place. The iron and coal are used to build the railways, right? Then those railways demand advanced machinery, which in turn spurs on scientific and technical education to keep everything running. That leads to modern banking, the rise of a rational middle class, and boom! Ultimately, you get a fully modernized, industrialized nation. And the sources show us that this exact formula worked absolutely perfectly in places like Britain, Germany, Italy, and Japan. It was basically considered an economic inevitability.
But here is where we hit a massive, and I mean massive, historical roadblock. India literally had all the ingredients. It had massive reserves of coal and iron. Under British rule, it developed one of the most extensive, sprawling railway networks on the planet. According to the theory, an industrial boom was an absolute guarantee. So, why did it actually result in deindustrialization? To answer that, let's move right along to Section 2, the Indian Railway Paradox. Let's quickly trace the timeline of this massive infrastructure project, because the source material maps out a really rapid expansion. Back in 1853, the very first train ran from Bombay to Thun. Fast forward a bit to Lord Curzon's era, and you see the highest rate of railway expansion. In 1902, the Robertson Commission was formed, which led to the Railway Board in 1905. And eventually, the rail budget was completely separated from the general budget in 1925. Now, on paper, this looks like incredible, rapid modernization. But the absolutely crucial detail to keep in mind here is that this whole thing was fueled entirely by British capital. And that brilliantly illustrates the real core of the paradox. Just look at the differing intents here. In Britain, the intent of building railways was domestic growth. It was for scientific advancement and expanding middle-class wealth. But the primary intent for building railways in India? Completely different. According to the historical sources, it was an extractive tool built specifically to serve British economic and military interests. Think about it. The tracks were laid strategically to connect raw material centers in the deep interior of India straight to the coastal ports. This ensured that resources, especially Indian cotton, which became super important when American cotton supplies were threatened, could be easily exported to factories back in Britain. Plus, it allowed for the swift movement of the military to suppress any local uprisings. So the railway wasn't built to boost the Indian economy, it was built to bypass it.
Which brings us to the devastating consequences on the ground. Let's look at Section 3, the fall of traditional handicrafts.
So how exactly did this extractive network function in reverse? Well, first, the railways connected major ports to remote interior villages. But instead of carrying Indian manufactured goods out to the global market, those trains brought cheap, machine-made British factory goods directly into the heart of local Indian markets. It was a one-way street. Indian artisans who were meticulously crafting goods by hand just couldn't compete with the sheer volume and dirt-cheap prices of those imported factory goods. They lost their market share almost overnight. This caused the total ruin of traditional handicrafts and led to widespread, devastating unemployment. Artisans were basically forced to abandon their centuries-old trades and fall back on agriculture, which severely overburdened the farming sector. And to make things even worse, the trains were also exporting massive amounts of local food grains out of the country, which actually exacerbated local food shortages and famines. So instead of sparking industrialization, the railways directly engineered deindustrialization.
Now you might be asking yourself, okay, even if it was extractive, didn't building all those tracks inject a ton of money into the local economy? Well, let's follow the money in Section 4, the Great Wealth Drain.
The financial discrepancy between the two nations is honestly staggering. To put this in perspective, let's compare construction costs. In Britain, building a railway cost roughly £9,000 per mile. In India, because of extreme extravagance and the fact that they imported literally all the machinery, it cost a massive £30,000 per mile. It's wild. And why were costs allowed to balloon like that? Because British companies investing in Indian railways were handed a guaranteed 5% dividend. Think about that for a second. In a normal market, investors take on risk. But here, the British government guaranteed their profit, even when the Indian railways ran at a massive financial loss. And once those expensive trains were actually running, the freight rates were highly discriminatory, meaning they charged higher prices to Indian merchants than to British ones. To really capture the deep frustration of this whole financial setup, the source text highlights a famous quote from the Indian nationalist Bal Gangadhar Tilak. He said the railway project was, quote, like spending on the decoration of another's wife. It's a powerful metaphor, right? It perfectly encapsulates the tragedy of the situation. Indian taxpayers were the ones footing the bill for this incredibly expensive, shiny new infrastructure, but all the economic benefits, all the wealth, was flowing strictly overseas. The Indian treasury was forced to pay that guaranteed 5% interest on the massive debt taken out to build the railways, which plunged the local economy into severe, long-term debt. This leads us right into our final analysis for today, Section 5, Evaluating the Colonial Impact.
The sources summarize this entire historical endeavor as a masterclass in public risk, private profit. The picture is crystal clear when you look at the data. The massive financial risk was placed entirely squarely on the Indian public, while all the private profits flowed directly out of the country. British industrialists, the middlemen, the merchants, they all profited immensely. Ship owners, insurance agents, and British banking houses got incredibly wealthy off the sheer volume of trade and those guaranteed returns. But on the flip side, the Indian taxpayers bore the entire debt burden of the construction and those guaranteed interest payouts. The net result? A heavily debt-ridden, economically backward country. Now, the railways did bring some positive social changes over time, like unifying markets and helping spread a sense of national consciousness. But purely economically speaking, they functioned as a massive, finely tuned mechanism for wealth extraction.
Which leaves us with a final, vital question to think about. The Indian railway paradox completely breaks Marxist theory, because it proves that technology and infrastructure alone absolutely do not guarantee economic progress. The context of who is building it and why they are building it matters entirely. So if infrastructure alone doesn't guarantee progress, who truly benefits when transformative technology is deployed without local sovereignty? It's a really powerful reminder to always look beneath the surface, or the tracks in this case, and follow the money. That is all for today's Explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and we'll catch you in the next one.